Hi, I'm Lucy Torres and I'm 34 years old. At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night, I received the kind of phone call that splits your life into before and after. My grandmother was found wandering downtown Phoenix in her nightgown, barefoot, with bruises covering her arms. The people who left her there? My uncle Marcus and his wife Elena. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing this wasn't the first time they'd hurt her, it was just the first time she couldn't hide it anymore. So I drove 180 miles through the desert darkness, straight into a family secret I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. What do you do when the people who raised the person who raised you are the ones destroying her from the inside out? If you've ever been betrayed by family, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you're ready to hear how I drove 180 miles to save my grandmother from those who should have protected her. The Arizona heat had finally broken around midnight, leaving behind that strange desert stillness that makes everything feel suspended in time. My apartment in Tucson felt unusually quiet. I had a half-empty glass of iced tea sweating on my coffee table, a muted documentary about art fraud playing in the background, and client files scattered across my dining room table. Just another Tuesday night in the life of a freelance investigative journalist. I was deep into researching a corruption scandal involving city council members when my phone lit up. 2 missed calls from an unknown Phoenix number. At first, I thought it might be a source or maybe someone from the paper wanting a last-minute quote. I was about to silence it when it buzzed again, the screen casting eerie shadows across the darkened room. "Lucy Torres?" a voice asked. Female, professional, tired. "Yes, this is Detective Rivera with Phoenix PD. Are you related to a Maria Elena Vasquez?" My breath caught. Not because of the name, I knew exactly who she was, but because of the way the detective said it. Carefully, like she was walking on glass. "She's my grandmother," I managed. "We have an elderly woman who matches her description," Detective Rivera continued. "Found about 2 hours ago near downtown, disoriented and injured. She kept asking for someone named Lucy. Said you'd know what to do." I blinked hard, trying to process what I was hearing. My grandmother, Abuela Maria, the woman who taught me to make tamales and told me stories about growing up in Sonora, wandering the streets of Phoenix alone. "I'm 3 hours away," I whispered, then louder. "Tell her I'm coming." It had been 4 years since I'd last seen Abuela Maria. 4 years since the funeral where Uncle Marcus made it clear that my questions about her care weren't welcome. 4 years since I'd stood in that cemetery, watching him play the devoted son while I'd always known, something was wrong. She'd raised me after my parents died in that car accident when I was 8. Marcus was supposed to help, being her only other child, but he was always too busy, too important, too whatever excuse fit the moment. When I graduated high school, Abuela moved in with him and Elena. "Just temporarily," she'd said. That was 16 years ago. I didn't pack anything. I grabbed my keys, my phone charger, and the digital recorder I always kept in my purse, old habits from years of journalism. I was out the door and on I-10 within minutes. The desert highway stretched endless in front of me, my headlights cutting through the darkness like accusations. The silence in the car was deafening. No music, no podcasts, just my thoughts racing faster than my speedometer. I kept thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Abuela Maria, a stilted phone call where Marcus had hovered in the background, monitoring every word. "Mija," she'd whispered when he left the room for a moment. "Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing." I'd asked what she meant, but Marcus had returned and she'd gone silent. I should have pressed harder. I should have driven up that day. I should have done something other than let it slide because confronting Marcus felt impossible. Mile markers flew past like accusations. Tucson to Phoenix, through desert towns that barely registered in my peripheral vision. Gas stations were closed. Other cars were rare. I drove through the night, alone with the weight of everything I'd chosen not to see. I reached downtown Phoenix just after 6 a.m. The city was beginning to wake up, early commuters grabbing coffee, joggers claiming the sidewalks before the heat became unbearable. I pulled into the parking lot of the community center where Detective Rivera had told me to meet them. And then I saw her. Abuela Maria was sitting on a bench near the building's entrance, wrapped in a blanket that was too big for her shrinking frame. Her gray hair was disheveled, her feet bare and dirty. She had on what looked like a faded nightgown under a worn cardigan. But it was her eyes that broke me, glassy, unfocused, like she was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. I parked so fast I nearly hit the curb. I left the door open behind me as I ran. "Abuela," I said, the Spanish rolling off my tongue like muscle memory. She didn't react at first. Her eyes remained fixed on some invisible point beyond my shoulder. Then, slowly, recognition flickered across her face. "Lucy?" she whispered. "Eres tú?" My throat tightened. "Sí, abuela. I'm here." She started to cry then, not the dramatic sobbing of movies, but the quiet, devastating tears of someone who'd given up hope of being found. Detective Rivera approached us slowly. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of this kind of thing. "She wouldn't let us take her to the hospital," she said quietly. "Kept saying someone would come for her." I knelt down beside Abuela Maria, taking her hands in mine. They were ice-cold despite the warm morning air, and I could see bruises on her wrists, finger-shaped marks that made my stomach turn. "What happened?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "She's been saying different things," Detective Rivera continued. "Some of it's hard to follow, but she mentioned your uncle. Said there was an argument about money. Said she was locked out." I looked at my grandmother's face, really looked at her. There was a bruise along her jaw, faded but unmistakable. Her lip was split. These weren't from a fall. "How long has she been missing?" I asked. "We're not sure. Your uncle reported her as confused and wandering off yesterday evening, but a security guard downtown says he saw her around the bus station Monday night." 2 days. She'd been on the streets for 2 days. I helped Abuela Maria into my car, cranking the air conditioning and pointing the vents toward her face. For a while we just sat there. The morning sun was already getting intense, casting long shadows across the parking lot. She didn't speak. Neither did I. I handed her a bottle of water from my console, and she drank it like she hadn't tasted anything real in days. "Mija," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the air conditioning. I didn't know who else to call. "You don't have to explain anything right now," I said, but I was lying. I needed to know. I needed to understand how we'd gotten here. Detective Rivera knocked on my window. I rolled it down. "There's something else," she said. "Your uncle and his wife are here. They want to take her home." Through the community center's glass doors, I could see them. Marcus, dressed in his usual business casual, looking every inch the concerned son. Elena beside him, her arms crossed, her expression more annoyed than worried. "She's not going back there," I said. "Ma'am, legally, unless she's been declared incompetent or there's evidence of abuse." "Look at her wrists," I interrupted. "Look at her face." Detective Rivera's eyes softened. "I see it. But without her making a formal complaint." I understood. I'd written enough stories about elder abuse to know how this worked. The system was built to keep families together, even when families were the problem. "Give me a moment," I said. I turned to Abuela Maria. "Do you want to go back to Marcus's house?" Her whole body tensed. She looked toward the building where I could see Marcus gesticulating at another officer, probably demanding his rights as next of kin. "No," she whispered. "Por favor, no." That was all I needed to hear. I spent the next hour filling out paperwork, making phone calls, and explaining to anyone who would listen that my grandmother was afraid to go home. It wasn't enough for a formal abuse investigation, but it was enough to buy us time. I found a small motel on the outskirts of Phoenix, the kind of place where the clerk doesn't ask questions and the Wi-Fi password is posted on construction paper taped to the wall. I checked us in under my name and helped Abuela Maria to the room. She moved slowly, like someone who'd learned to make herself small and quiet. When we got inside, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the generic landscape painting on the wall. I brought her soup from the vending machine and a sandwich from the gas station next door. She looked at the food like I'd handed her something foreign. When did you last eat? I asked. She shrugged. Elena said I was taking too much food. That I needed to be more careful. My jaw clenched. Elena, who drove a BMW and wore designer handbags, was rationing food for my 78-year-old grandmother. I sat down beside her. Tell me what happened. For a long time she didn't answer. Then, so quietly I had to lean in to hear her, I asked about the money. What money? From selling the house. Papa's house. Marcus said it was gone, all of it, but I found papers. Her voice trailed off. What kind of papers? She looked at me with eyes that held too many secrets. Account numbers. Big numbers. Money I never saw. My grandfather had owned a small grocery store in South Phoenix for 40 years. When he died, he'd left the property to Abuela Maria. Marcus had convinced her to sell it 5 years ago, saying she needed the money for her care. How much money? I asked. More than I could count, she said. But when I asked Marcus, he got angry. Said I was confused, that there was never any money. Said I was imagining things. Classic gaslighting. Make the victim doubt their own reality. And Elena? Abuela Maria's face darkened. She said I was ungrateful. That after everything they'd done for me, I was accusing them of stealing. She said if I couldn't appreciate their help, maybe I should find somewhere else to live. So they kicked you out. Marcus said it was just for the night. To teach me a lesson. But then the door was locked and I waited and no one came. Her voice broke. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling how fragile she'd become. My strong, fierce grandmother who'd once chased neighborhood bullies away with a wooden spoon was now afraid to eat too much soup. That night while she slept, I sat at the small motel desk with my laptop and started doing what I did best, investigating. I pulled property records, court documents, financial filings, anything I could access remotely. The grocery store had sold for $850,000. According to the documents I could find, the money had been placed in a trust with Marcus as the administrator. But there were gaps, transfers I couldn't track, accounts that led to dead ends. I called my editor at the Phoenix Herald, Sarah Martinez, even though it was past midnight. Lucy? What's wrong? I need a favor, I said. How fast can you run a background check? Depends on who and why. My uncle. And because I think he's been stealing from my grandmother. Send me what you have. I spent the next 3 hours forwarding documents, writing summaries, and explaining the situation. Sarah had connections I didn't, sources and places I couldn't reach. If there was something to find, she'd find it. My phone buzzed just after 3 a.m. A text from an unknown number, "Stop digging where you don't belong." I screenshot the message and added it to the growing file I was building. Someone was watching. Someone was worried. The next morning, Abuela Maria was awake before me, sitting by the window and watching the sun rise over the desert. She looked smaller in the daylight, more fragile, but there was something different in her posture. Straighter. More determined. Mija, she said when she noticed I was awake. I remembered something. I sat up, instantly alert. What? The safe. In Marcus's office at home. I saw him put papers in there. Bank papers. Maybe those papers you need. A safe. Of course. Marcus always was paranoid about security. Do you know the combination? She smiled for the first time since I'd found her. Your grandfather's birthday. Marcus never was very creative. I made coffee with the room's ancient coffee maker and sat down beside her. Abuela, if we do this, if we try to prove what Marcus did, it's going to get ugly. He's not going to just admit it. Mija, she said, taking my hand. I spent 60 years with your grandfather building something. I won't let them steal it and pretend I'm too old to remember. That steel in her voice, that was the grandmother I remembered. My phone rang. Sarah. You need to see this, she said without preamble. Can you get to a computer? I opened my laptop and logged into the secure server she'd sent me credentials for. The files that loaded made my stomach drop. Marcus Torres wasn't just stealing from my grandmother. He'd been running a business, using his position as caregiver and power of attorney to systematically drain elderly clients' accounts. Bank transfers, forged signatures, falsified medical records claiming mental incompetence, it was all there. How many? I asked. At least 6 other families that I can document. Probably more. This wasn't just about Abuela Maria anymore. This was about a pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. Sarah, I need to get into his house. Lucy, you're a journalist, not a cop. Let the authorities handle this. The authorities need evidence. And I know where to find it. After I hung up, I sat staring at the files on my screen. 6 other families. 6 other grandmothers and grandfathers who'd trusted their children to take care of them and been betrayed instead. I looked at Abuela Maria, who was still sitting by the window, watching the world wake up. We're going to get them, I said. She nodded. Sí, mija. We are. The rest of the morning was spent planning. I called Detective Rivera and shared what Sarah had found. She was interested but cautious. Without physical evidence, much of what we had was circumstantial. I need those documents from the safe, she said. If you can get them legally. What if I had permission from the homeowner? Your grandmother doesn't live there anymore. But she never officially moved out. She was just locked out. Detective Rivera was quiet for a long moment. I can't tell you to break into someone's house. But if evidence of elder abuse just happened to surface, I'd have to investigate it thoroughly. I understood. She couldn't sanction what I was planning, but she wouldn't stop me either. That afternoon, I drove past Marcus's house. It was in North Phoenix, one of those sprawling subdivisions where every house looked the same and the lawns were always perfect despite the desert climate. His BMW was gone, probably at the office. Elena's Mercedes was in the driveway. I parked 3 blocks away and walked back, trying to look like a neighbor out for exercise. The house sat on a corner lot with minimal landscaping and security cameras at the front door and driveway. But the backyard was hidden by a tall privacy fence. I remembered playing in that backyard as a child, helping Abuela Maria tend the small garden she'd insisted on planting despite Elena's complaints about water bills. There used to be a loose board in the fence where the neighbor's dog had dug underneath. If it was still there. It was. I waited until evening when the neighborhood settled into dinner routines and television programs. I drove Abuela Maria back to the motel and made sure she was safe before returning alone. The loose board was exactly where I remembered it. I squeezed through into the backyard, grateful for all those years of rock climbing that had kept me flexible. The garden was gone now, replaced by decorative gravel and a few struggling cacti. The back sliding door was unlocked, Elena's chronic overconfidence working in my favor. I slipped inside, my phone's flashlight providing just enough light to navigate. Marcus's office was exactly as I remembered it. Dark wood furniture, law degrees on the walls, family photos that prominently featured him and conspicuously excluded me. The safe was behind his desk, a large black box that probably cost more than most people's cars. I tried grandfather's birthday, 031842. Nothing. I tried the date backwards, 420318. Nothing. Then I remembered, Abuela Maria always celebrated his birthday by the lunar calendar, the way they had in Mexico. I pulled up a lunar calendar app and found the date that corresponded to March 18, 1942. The safe clicked open. Inside, stacks of documents. Bank statements, property deeds, signed contracts. And there, in a manila folder labeled MEV Trust, everything I needed. Bank statements showing the $850,000 from the grocery store sale being moved through a series of accounts before landing in one under Marcus's sole control. Forged signatures on documents claiming Abuela Maria was mentally incompetent. Medical records that had been altered to support guardianship proceedings that never actually happened. But the worst was at the bottom of the stack, a handwritten note in Marcus's unmistakable scrawl. The old woman is getting suspicious about the money. We need to accelerate the timeline. If she becomes a problem, we have options. I photographed everything with my phone, hands shaking as I tried to keep the images steady. This wasn't just financial abuse, it was a deliberate, calculated plan to isolate and control my grandmother. A car door slammed in the driveway. I shoved the documents back into the folder, closed the safe, and headed for the back door. Through the front window, I could see Elena walking up the driveway, arms full of shopping bags. I made it to the fence just as I heard the front door open. Squeezed through the loose board and ran the 3 blocks to my car, adrenaline making my legs feel like rubber. Back at the motel, I uploaded all the photos to Sarah's secure server and sent copies to Detective Rivera. Then I sat on the bed next to Abuela Maria and showed her what I'd found. She looked through the images in silence, her face growing harder with each document. 60 años, she finally said. 60 years your grandfather and I worked for this. We're going to get it back, I promised. No, Mija. We're going to get justice. The money. She waved her hand dismissively. The money is just paper. But what they did to me, what they did to those other families, that's what matters. My phone rang. Detective Rivera. How soon can you and your grandmother come in? She asked. We're issuing warrants. We'll be there in an hour. As we drove back into Phoenix, I thought about all the stories I'd covered over the years. Political corruption, corporate fraud, environmental cover-ups, but none of them had felt as personal as this. This wasn't just a story. This was family. This was betrayal wrapped in the language of love and care. Mija, Abuela Maria said as we pulled into the police station parking lot. I want to tell you something. I turned to look at her. When you were little, after your parents died, I used to worry I wasn't enough. That you needed more than an old woman could give you. But watching you now, seeing how you fight for what's right. She smiled. Your parents would be proud. I'm proud. The next few hours were a blur of statements, documents, and phone calls. Detective Rivera worked with efficiency that spoke to years of experience, but I could see the anger in her eyes as she reviewed the evidence. This is bigger than we thought, she said. The pattern goes back at least 8 years. We're looking at potential RICO charges. RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. They weren't just treating this as elder abuse anymore. This was organized crime. Marcus and Elena were arrested that evening at their house. I wasn't there to see it, but Detective Rivera called to let me know. They're denying everything, she said. Claiming your grandmother is mentally ill and you're manipulating her. Do you have enough to hold them? With what you found in that safe, we have enough to put them away for a long time. The story broke in the Phoenix Herald 3 days later. Sarah had worked around the clock to verify sources and fact-check details. The headline read, Local businessman accused of massive elder abuse scheme. By that afternoon, it had been picked up by national outlets. My phone wouldn't stop ringing, reporters, producers, advocates from elder rights organizations. Everyone wanted to talk to the grandmother who'd fought back and the granddaughter who'd helped her do it. But the call that mattered most came from Detective Rivera. We found them, she said. Found who? The other families. 6 more people came forward after the story ran. And Lucy, we found where the money went. Offshore accounts. Real estate investments under shell companies. A lifestyle funded by stealing from people who trusted them most. What about Abuela Maria's money? We're working on asset recovery. It'll take time, but we should be able to get most of it back. That night, I sat with Abuela Maria in the garden of her new apartment, a small place near my office in Tucson where she could see the mountains and tend to the tomatoes she'd insisted on planting despite the rocky soil. Do you regret it? I asked. Going through all of this? She was quiet for a long time, her weathered hands gentle on the tomato plants. Mija, she finally said, for too long I let fear make me small. Let them convince me I was forgetting things, imagining things. But memory, real memory, that lives in here. She touched her chest. And what I remembered was that your grandfather and I didn't work 60 years to give thieves a comfortable life. The weeks following the arrests were a whirlwind of media attention and legal proceedings. Every morning brought new revelations as Detective Rivera's team unraveled the full scope of Marcus and Elena's operation. I found myself thrust into the role of both journalist and advocate, fielding calls from families across the Southwest who suspected similar abuse. One call particularly stood out. Mrs. Patricia Williamson from Flagstaff, her voice shaking as she described how her son had convinced her to sell her late husband's ranch, promising to invest the money for her retirement. The parallels to Abuela Maria's story were chilling. "He says I'm too old to understand finances," she whispered into the phone. "Says I should be grateful he's handling everything. But I haven't seen a penny, and when I ask questions he gets angry." I drove to Flagstaff the next day. Mrs. Williamson lived in a cramped apartment above a used bookstore, a far cry from the sprawling ranch she described. Her son had convinced her to move there temporarily while he managed her affairs. That was 3 years ago. Her story unfolded like a carbon copy of what had happened to Abuela Maria. Forged documents, manipulated medical evaluations, isolation from friends and other family members. Her son had even changed her phone number without telling her, claiming she was receiving too many confusing calls. I stayed in Flagstaff for 3 days, documenting everything, connecting Mrs. Williamson with Detective Rivera's team. By the time I left, we had enough evidence to add her son to the growing list of conspirators in what prosecutors were now calling the largest elder abuse ring in Arizona's history. The investigation expanded beyond Arizona. Similar patterns emerged in New Mexico, California, and Nevada. Marcus and Elena hadn't just been stealing from elderly clients, they'd been part of a network, sharing techniques and even trading victims across state lines. Dr. Susan Chen, a geriatrician who specialized in elder abuse cases, became a key witness for the prosecution. I interviewed her extensively for my ongoing coverage of the case. "What people don't understand," she told me over coffee in her hospital cafeteria, "is how sophisticated these operations have become. They target specific vulnerabilities, recent widowhood, early signs of memory loss, adult children who live far away. They create artificial crises that justify taking control." She showed me a presentation she'd given at medical conferences, outlining the warning signs. Sudden changes in financial arrangements. Elderly people becoming withdrawn or fearful around certain family members. Unexplained injuries. Missing personal belongings. "Your grandmother was lucky," Dr. Chin said. "She had you. Many victims don't have anyone advocating for them." That conversation stayed with me as I continued covering the story. How many other Abuela Marias were out there, isolated and afraid, convinced they were imagining the theft of their life's work? The legal proceedings intensified as autumn arrived. Marcus's lawyers attempted every defense strategy in the book, claiming Abuela Maria was mentally incompetent, arguing that I had manipulated evidence, even suggesting that the other victims were part of some elaborate conspiracy against their clients. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records don't lie. Forged signatures can be analyzed. And the testimonies of 9 elderly victims, all telling variations of the same story, painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. Elena cracked first. Faced with federal racketeering charges and the possibility of 20 years in prison, she agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed the true scope of the operation. "Marcus had it all planned out," she told the courtroom, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said elderly people were easy targets because they trusted family, and even if they complained, who would believe them over their own children?" She described how they'd identify potential victims through Marcus's work as a financial advisor, targeting recently widowed clients with substantial assets and no close family oversight. They'd gradually gain control through a combination of manipulation, intimidation, and forged documents. "He kept detailed files on each victim," Elena continued. "Notes about their weaknesses, their fears, what buttons to push to keep them compliant. The courtroom was silent as she described the playbook they developed. Isolate the victim from potential allies. Create financial emergencies that justified taking control. Use gaslighting techniques to make them doubt their own memories and perceptions. What about the physical abuse? Prosecutor Janet Morrison asked. Elena's face crumpled. Marcus said sometimes you had to remind them who was in charge. He said a little fear kept them from asking too many questions. I watched Abuela Maria during Elena's testimony. She sat straight-backed in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. When Elena described the night they'd locked her out, claiming it was just to teach her a lesson, I saw my grandmother's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. During a break in the proceedings, Abuela Maria and I walked to a small park across from the courthouse. She sat on a bench and watched pigeons pecking at breadcrumbs someone had scattered on the ground. Are you okay? I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. You know, Mija, when I was young in Mexico, my grandmother used to tell stories about brujas, witches who could steal your soul little by little until you forgot who you were. I always thought they were just stories. She looked at me with eyes that held decades of wisdom and recent pain. But that's what they did to me. Not with magic, but with lies and fear and making me doubt my own mind. They almost stole my soul. But they didn't, I said firmly. You're still here. You're still fighting. She smiled then, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in weeks. Sí, mija. I'm still here. The trial resumed with Marcus taking the stand in his own defense. It was a calculated risk by his attorneys, but they were running out of options. Elena's testimony had been devastating, and the physical evidence was irrefutable. Marcus presented himself as a devoted son overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring for an increasingly confused mother. He claimed the financial irregularities were simply misunderstandings, that he'd been trying to protect my grandmother from her own poor judgment. Mrs. Vasquez had become increasingly paranoid and confused, he testified, his voice steady and reasonable. She would forget conversations we'd had, accuse us of things that never happened. We were trying to help her, but she fought us every step of the way. It was a masterful performance. If I hadn't seen the evidence, if I hadn't witnessed firsthand what they'd done to Abuela Maria, I might have believed him myself. But Prosecutor Morrison was ready for him. Mr. Torres, she said, approaching the witness stand with a folder of documents, you testified that you were trying to protect your mother from poor financial decisions. Is that correct? Yes, that's right. And yet, according to these bank records, in the 2 years following the sale of your mother's property, you purchased a new BMW, took 3 international vacations, and put a down payment on a vacation home in Sedona. All while your mother was living on a grocery budget of $50 a week. Can you explain that? Marcus's composure cracked slightly. Those purchases were, I work hard. I deserve to enjoy the fruits of my labor. With your mother's money? It wasn't her money anymore. She had signed everything over to me for her own protection. Under false pretenses, according to the medical evaluations we've reviewed. Dr. Martinez, who examined your mother last month, found no evidence of the dementia you claimed justified taking control of her finances. The questioning continued for hours. Morrison methodically dismantled every aspect of Marcus's defense, using his own words and actions against him. The man who had seemed so reasonable at the beginning of his testimony appeared increasingly desperate and angry as the day wore on. When Morrison asked about the night they'd locked Abuela Maria out, Marcus's mask finally slipped completely. She was being disrespectful. He snapped. After everything we'd done for her, she was accusing us of stealing. She needed to learn some gratitude. So you left a 78-year-old woman outside in her nightgown to teach her gratitude? It was just for one night. She was supposed to come back apologetic, ready to behave. But she didn't come back, did she, Mr. Torres? She ended up wandering the streets for 2 days before police found her. Marcus's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the real Marcus Torres, not the devoted son, but the controlling abuser who felt entitled to his mother's life savings and willing to use cruelty to maintain control. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I covered it for the Herald, sitting in the courtroom every day and watching Marcus and Elena's facade crumble under the weight of evidence. Other families testified, elderly parents who'd been isolated, confused, and systematically robbed by children they'd trusted. Mrs. Williamson took the stand on a Tuesday morning, her voice stronger than it had been that first day I met her in Flagstaff. She told the jury about losing her husband of 53 years, about trusting her son to help her navigate her grief and finances, about slowly realizing that the son she'd raised had become someone she didn't recognize. "He told me I was lucky to have him," she testified. Said other old people end up in nursing homes, forgotten by their families. "He made me feel like I should be grateful for every small kindness, even while he was stealing my husband's legacy." The emotional impact of her testimony was profound. Several jurors wiped away tears as she described being moved from her ranch, the place where she'd raised her children and built a life, to the cramped apartment where she'd lived in isolation for 3 years. On the final day of testimony, Abuela Maria took the stand. She had insisted on testifying despite my concerns about the stress it might cause her. She wore a simple black dress and the pearl earrings my grandfather had given her for their 40th anniversary. Her testimony was brief but powerful. She spoke about a lifetime of work, about trusting her son to honor her late husband's memory, about the gradual erosion of her autonomy and dignity. "They didn't just steal my money," she told the jury, her voice clear and strong. "They stole my sense of myself. They made me feel like I was disappearing, like I didn't matter anymore except as a source of income for their comfortable life." When Prosecutor Morrison asked her what she wanted from the proceedings, Abuela Maria looked directly at Marcus for the first time since the trial began. "I want other families to know that this can happen to anyone," she said. "I want other grandmothers to know that feeling confused or afraid doesn't mean you're imagining things. And I want my son to understand that love isn't supposed to hurt." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Marcus got 15 years. Elena got 12. Both were ordered to pay restitution totaling more than $3 million. But the real victory came in the smaller moments. Mrs. Chen, whose son had stolen her immigration documents along with her savings, got her papers back and moved in with her daughter who'd been searching for her for 2 years. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd been convinced he was going senile when money kept disappearing from his accounts, regained control of his finances and his dignity. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Arizona. The story had captured national attention, leading to legislative hearings in multiple states about strengthening elder abuse protections. I found myself testifying before congressional committees, sharing Abuela Maria's story and the lessons we'd learned from the investigation. Senator Rebecca Hayes, who chaired the Senate Committee on Aging, contacted me directly after reading my coverage of the trial. She was working on a comprehensive elder abuse prevention bill and wanted to incorporate some of the red flags we'd identified into federal guidelines. "Your grandmother's case illustrates everything wrong with our current system," she told me during a phone interview. "We have laws on the books, but they're reactive rather than preventive. By the time someone like your grandmother ends up on the streets, irreparable damage has already been done." The legislation that emerged, dubbed the Maria Vasquez Elder Protection Act, required financial institutions to implement additional safeguards when elderly account holders made large withdrawals or transferred assets to family members. It also mandated training for bank employees, healthcare workers, and social services staff on recognizing signs of financial abuse. But perhaps more importantly, the case had changed the conversation around elder abuse. Media outlets that had previously treated such stories as isolated incidents began covering them as part of a larger systemic problem. Support groups formed in communities across the country. Adult children started having difficult conversations with their aging parents about financial safety. Dr. Susan Chen invited me to co-author a research paper on the case for the Journal of Elder Abuse and Neglect. Working with her team, we analyzed the patterns we'd uncovered and developed a framework for identifying and preventing similar schemes. The sophistication of this operation was unprecedented, she wrote in our introduction. But the tactics they used, isolation, gaslighting, financial manipulation, are unfortunately common. What made this case unique was having a family member with the skills and resources to fight back. That phrase haunted me. How many other elderly people were suffering in silence because they didn't have someone with my particular combination of investigative training and family connection to advocate for them? The question led me to make a career change. 6 months after the trial ended, I left my position at the Herald and founded the Desert Justice Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to investigating elder abuse cases and connecting victims with resources. Our first office was a cramped space above a Mexican restaurant in downtown Tucson, furnished with donated furniture and powered by determination. Abuela Maria insisted on volunteering, despite my protests that she should be enjoying her retirement. "Mija," she said, sorting through intake forms at a desk we'd bought at a yard sale, "retirement is for people who finish their work. I'm not finished yet." She was right. Within 6 months, we were handling over 30 active cases. The patterns were depressingly familiar: adult children who had gradually gained control of their parents' finances, professional caregivers who were stealing from vulnerable clients, and sophisticated scams targeting elderly people who were isolated and confused. Each case taught us something new about the depth and complexity of elder abuse. There was Margaret Sullivan, whose daughter had convinced her to invest her life savings in a fake real estate scheme. Robert Kim, whose nephew had forged his signature on reverse mortgage documents. Patricia Santos, whose caregiver had been slowly poisoning her with sleeping medication to keep her compliant while emptying her bank accounts. But there were victories too. We helped James Crawford recover $200,000 that his son had stolen through forged power of attorney documents. We worked with prosecutors to convict a home health care aide who had been stealing jewelry and medications from her elderly clients. We connected isolated seniors with support networks that helped them maintain their independence and dignity. The work was emotionally exhausting but deeply fulfilling. Every case felt personal in a way that my journalism never had. These weren't just stories I was telling, they were lives I was helping to rebuild. One afternoon, about a year after we'd opened our doors, I received a call that took me back to the beginning of this journey. Detective Rivera was retiring from the Phoenix PD and wanted to meet for coffee before she left. We met at the same community center where I'd first found Abuela Maria. Rivera looked tired but satisfied, the expression of someone who'd spent her career fighting good fights. "I wanted to thank you," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Your grandmother's case changed how we approach elder abuse investigations. We've opened 17 new cases using the techniques we developed working with you." "You don't need to thank me," I replied. "You were the one who took us seriously when we needed it most." "That's just it. Before your case, I probably wouldn't have. I would have seen an elderly woman with some bruises and assumed she'd fallen. I would have listened to the family's explanation and moved on. You taught me to look deeper." She pulled out a folder from her briefcase. "I wanted to show you something before I go." Inside were case files from the 17 investigations she'd mentioned. Elderly victims across Phoenix who had been isolated, abused, and robbed by people they trusted. Because of the precedent set by Abuela Maria's case, all 17 had been taken seriously. All 17 had received justice. "This is your grandmother's real legacy," Rivera said. "Not just getting her own justice, but making it possible for others to get theirs too." As I drove back to Tucson that evening, I thought about legacy and the unexpected directions life can take us. A year ago, I'd been a freelance journalist struggling to make ends meet, estranged from most of my family, focused primarily on my own career advancement. Now I was running a nonprofit organization, working directly with elderly abuse victims, and had somehow become a national advocate for elder rights. The transformation hadn't been planned or even wanted, it had been thrust upon me by circumstances and shaped by a sense of responsibility I couldn't ignore. Abuela Maria was in her garden when I arrived home, tending to the tomato plants that had somehow thrived in Arizona's challenging soil. She looked up as I approached, her face bright with the satisfaction that comes from nurturing something into growth. "How was Phoenix?" she asked. "Good. Detective Rivera is retiring. She wanted to show me how many other cases grew out of yours." Abuela Maria nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather used to say that stones thrown in still water create ripples that travel farther than you can see. I think maybe our stone created some good ripples." That evening, as we sat on her small patio watching the sunset paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and purple, I felt a profound sense of completion. Not the kind that comes from finishing a project, but the deeper satisfaction of understanding your place in a larger story. The tomatoes Abuela Maria had planted that first day were now producing their second season of fruit. The plants had grown strong and resilient, their roots deep enough to weather Arizona's harsh summers and mild winters. And Abuela Maria, she started a support group for elder abuse survivors. Every Thursday afternoon, her living room fills with people who understand that being vulnerable doesn't mean being powerless. 6 months after that night I found her wandering downtown Phoenix. I got a letter from a woman in Denver whose mother had gone missing. The local news had covered our story, and she wondered if I could help. I could. I did. The Desert Justice Project expanded to handle cases across the Southwest. We developed partnerships with law enforcement agencies, social services departments, and legal aid organizations. What started as a personal quest for justice had become a regional network dedicated to protecting elderly people from abuse and exploitation. Our success led to speaking engagements at conferences, consulting opportunities with other nonprofits, and eventually a book deal to tell the full story of the investigation and its aftermath. The advance from that book became seed money to open a second office in Phoenix and hire our first full-time staff members. But the most rewarding moments still came in the quiet victories, helping an elderly man reclaim his stolen pension, connecting an isolated grandmother with family members who had been searching for her, providing evidence that led to the conviction of a caregiver who had been systematically abusing her clients. Each case reinforced the lesson I'd learned from Abuela Maria's experience. Elder abuse thrives in silence and isolation. When victims have advocates, when their stories are believed and their evidence is taken seriously, justice becomes possible. The work also taught me about resilience and the remarkable capacity of elderly people to rebuild their lives after devastating betrayals. Mrs. Williamson, the woman from Flagstaff whose son had stolen her ranch, eventually started a small business selling handmade quilts to tourists. At 76, she was supporting herself and had regained her independence. Mr. Rodriguez, who had been convinced he was developing dementia when money kept disappearing from his accounts, became one of our most effective volunteers. His experience with gaslighting made him uniquely qualified to recognize the signs in other victims and help them understand that their confusion wasn't a sign of mental decline, but a symptom of psychological abuse. The network of survivors that grew around our work became its own source of strength and healing. People who had been isolated and afraid discovered they weren't alone. The shame and self-doubt that accompany abuse began to lift when victims realized they were part of a larger community of people who had faced similar challenges. 3 years after the trial that had started it all, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The Arizona Attorney General's office was hosting a conference on elder abuse prevention, and they wanted me to deliver the keynote address. I stood at the podium in a conference room filled with law enforcement officers, social workers, healthcare professionals, and family members of abuse victims. Many faces were familiar, people I'd worked with over the years, allies who had become friends in our shared mission to protect vulnerable elderly people. But the face that mattered most to me was in the front row. Abuela Maria, now 81 years old, wearing the same pearl earrings she'd worn to testify at Marcus's trial. Her presence reminded me of where this journey had started and why it mattered. I began my speech with her story, the call that had changed everything, the drive through the desert night, finding her outside that community center, scared and alone but somehow still fighting. I talked about the investigation, the trial, and the broader implications of what we'd learned. But I ended with something more personal. My grandmother taught me that strength isn't about never falling down, I told the audience. It's about who helps you get back up and what you do with the second chance you're given. She could have spent her remaining years bitter about what was stolen from her. Instead, she chose to use her experience to help others avoid the same fate. That choice, to transform personal pain into collective action, is available to all of us. Every case we solve, every victim we help, every family we reunite is a victory not just for that individual, but for the principle that elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and protection from those who would exploit their vulnerability. After the conference, Abuela Maria and I drove back to Tucson together. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, the same landscape I'd traveled that night 3 years ago when everything began. But now it felt different, less harsh, more familiar. This was home, and we had made it a safer place for people like her. Because the truth is, family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up when everything falls apart. It's about who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is refuse to be silent when silence serves the people causing harm. Abuela Maria is by now. She still makes the best tamales in Arizona, still tells stories about growing up in Sonora, and still insists on tending her garden despite arthritic hands that make it difficult. But she also speaks at conferences about elder abuse. She testifies before legislative committees about the need for stronger protection laws. And every morning she wakes up in her own home, makes her own decisions, and remembers that being old doesn't mean being powerless. The Desert Justice Project continues to grow. We've helped over 300 families recover stolen assets, worked with prosecutors to convict dozens of abusers, and trained thousands of professionals to recognize and respond to elder abuse. The Maria Vasquez Elder Protection Act has been adopted by 12 states, with more legislation pending. But the most important measure of our success isn't in the numbers. It's in the letters I receive from elderly people who say they feel less afraid, in the phone calls from adult children who have learned to spot warning signs, in the knowledge that somewhere tonight, fewer elderly people are suffering in silence. Marcus was denied parole last year. Elena was released after serving 8 years but remains on probation and is prohibited from working in any capacity that involves access to elderly clients or their finances. The money they stole has been largely recovered, though the emotional damage they caused will never be fully healed. I think about them sometimes, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of sad bewilderment. How does someone decide that their comfort is worth more than their mother's dignity? How do you look in the mirror after stealing from the people who gave you life? But I don't spend much time on those questions. There's too much work to be done, too many people who need help, too many stories waiting to be told. The tomatoes she planted that first day in Tucson? They're still growing. Stronger every season, roots deep enough to weather any storm. Just like her. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Sometimes the hardest battles we fight are the ones against people we love or thought we loved. But some silences are too dangerous to keep, and some truths are too important to bury. Let me know in the comments if this story resonated with you.